The Midnight Griddle Diner didn't just smell of stale grease and burnt coffee. It reeked of a long, hopeless night and something sharper underneath, the metallic tang of impending violence. Layla scrubbed the Formica counter with a worn-out rag, her movements slow and practiced. Just another invisible girl in a polyester uniform. But her eyes, a stormy gray, never stopped moving. They flicked toward the corner booth like a magnet finding north. He sat there, Kalen. Even slumped in a ragged wool coat, damp with melted snow, he filled the space. Not with his size, but with a presence that felt like a thundercloud trapped in a glass jar. Power hummed around him, a low-frequency vibration that made the silverware tremble against the chipped plates. He was waiting, Layla knew for who. Celine, his so-called fated queen, the woman the whole kingdom talked about. But Celine wasn't coming. The men in the black SUV outside had arrived 20 minutes ago. They hadn't come for the pie. Layla's heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She wasn't a hero, she was a ghost, a rogue wolf with no name and no pack, surviving by never being seen. But she couldn't just stand here and watch a king be slaughtered. Her hand trembled as she pulled a pen from her apron. On the back of a greasy order receipt, her handwriting was a desperate scrawl. She tore it free. The paper felt like a lit fuse in her fingers. She forced her legs to move. The checkered board tiles seemed to stretch endlessly. She reached his table, the glass coffee pot heavy in her hand. Refill? Her voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse. He didn't look up. His gaze was fixed on the door, on the swirling snow beyond the glass. A look of quiet, tender expectation was on his face. It made her stomach clench. "No," he murmured, his voice a deep rumble that vibrated in the hollow of her chest. "I'm waiting for someone." "You need this," she insisted, the words coming out more urgent than she intended. She set the cup down with a sharp clink, coffee sloshing over the rim. In the same motion, she slid the folded square of paper under the saucer, tapping it once with her finger. "On the house." She turned and walked away. She didn't run. Running attracted predators, but every nerve in her body screamed that she was being watched. She made it back to the counter, gripping the stainless steel edge until her knuckles turned white. She counted the seconds in the frantic rhythm of her pulse. 1, 2, 3. Behind her, the ambient diner noise, the hum of the cooler, the drip of the coffee maker, changed. The air grew thick and still. The silence was no longer empty. It was the silence of a coiled spring. She dared a glance over her shoulder. Kalen had the note in his hand. He wasn't looking at the door anymore. He was staring at the empty seat opposite him, the seat meant for Celine. His expression didn't twist into anger. It simply dissolved. The hopeful light in his golden eyes extinguished, leaving behind a hollow, devastating stillness. A king discovering his throne was made of ice. Then, movement. The man in the far booth stood up. A sleek, silenced pistol cleared his jacket. Kalen didn't shift. He didn't roar. With a speed that blurred the air, he flipped the heavy oak table in front of him with one hand. It crashed onto its side just as the first phut of the silent shot echoed. Wood splinters exploded like shrapnel. The diner's neon sign blew out in a shower of sparks and glass, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the eerie glow of the emergency exit sign and the headlights from the SUV outside. Chaos, Layla realized, wasn't loud. It was a series of sharp, sickening punctuation marks in the quiet. A thud of a body hitting the wall, a crunch of breaking bone, a gurgled cry cut short. She dropped behind the counter, pressing herself against the cold cabinets. The new smell hit her then, acrid and bitter, burning her nostrils. Wolfsbane. They'd gassed the place. It was a sophisticated trap, meant to keep a shifter from accessing his wolf, to force him to fight as a mortal man. But the man fighting in the dark didn't sound mortal. Another body, this one in tactical gear, sailed over the counter and landed in the sink with a wet, terminal crash. A hand, hard as iron and searing hot, clamped around her arm and hauled her to her feet. Move. The word was a growl breathed directly into her ear. Kalen. Blood streaked his temple, and his eyes glowed like molten coins in the gloom. Exits are rigged. Is there another way? Her mind, frozen with terror, thawed into pure survival instinct. Kitchen, loading dock. Go. He didn't shove her behind him. He pushed her ahead, placing his broad frame between her and the remaining shadows moving in the diner. He was using his body as her shield. They burst through the swinging doors into the harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen. It was freezing. The metal delivery door hung open, twisted on its hinges, letting in a swirl of snow. And two more men, silhouetted against the blinding headlights of a second vehicle. Kalen didn't pause. He snatched a cast-iron skillet from a hook and hurled it at one of the men. It spun through the air and connected with the first man's head with a sickening clang. The man dropped like a sack of stones. The second man raised a rifle. Kalen moved, but he was slower now. The wolfsbane was in his system. A shot rang out and Kalen jerked backward with a sharp hiss. A dark bloom of blood spread high on his shoulder. Silver, it had to be. "You're hit!" Layla gasped. "Walk," he commanded, his voice strained. But the gunman was advancing, the rifle steady. Kalen tried to summon a charge, but his legs buckled. The silver was poisoning him fast. Layla stood frozen in the kitchen doorway. The wild, snowy woods were right there. She could run. She could shift into her small, gray wolf form and vanish into the night. This wasn't her war. He was a king, and kings had crowns and enemies and fated mates who betrayed them. She looked at his left hand, still clenched in a fist. Even while fighting for his life, he hadn't dropped her note. Your mate sold you out. He was utterly alone. Something hot and fierce erupted in Layla's chest. She was not a warrior, but she was a survivor, and she knew how to fight dirty. Her hand closed around the handle of a boning knife on the magnetic strip by the door. The gunman had Kalen pinned against a stainless steel table, pressing a silver-tipped blade toward his throat. Kalen's strength was failing, his arms shaking. Layla didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She sprinted across the icy concrete and drove the knife deep into the back of the gunman's thigh. The man screamed, his grip faltering. Kalen surged upward, his forehead connecting with the man's nose with a horrific crunch. The attacker collapsed, motionless. Kalen staggered back, chest heaving. He looked at the fallen man, then at Layla, then at the bloody knife in her hand. His breath fogged in the Arctic air. "Why?" he rasped, the word full of pain and utter confusion. "Later," she said, her own voice surprisingly steady. She grabbed his uninjured arm. "I can hear more engines. We walk now." "My car is a death trap. If she sold you out, she gave them the make and model. We walk." He was a king. Kings did not run, but he looked at the crimson staining the pristine snow, his blood, and gave a single sharp nod. His pride had been shattered along with his trust. All that was left was the will to live. "Lead the way," he growled. And she did, pulling him into the teeth of the blizzard, away from the lights and into the consuming, merciful dark of the pines. The hunt was over. Now the real chase had begun. The forest was a white, roaring beast. Snow fell in thick, suffocating sheets, swallowing the world and silencing the distant sounds of pursuit. It was a blessing and a curse. It hid them, but it also tried to kill them with every step. Layla dragged Kalen through drifts that reached their knees. The wet, heavy snow sucked at their legs, sapping strength with each labored breath. The wind howled through the ancient pines, a shrieking chorus that bit through their thin clothes and stole the warmth from their skin. She led them off the known paths, away from the deer trails, and into the rugged, rocky ribs of the mountain. This was her territory. These woods had been her larder, her shelter, her only constant. She knew where the hidden streams cut under the ice, and where the overhangs offered meager protection. Kalen was a dead weight against her side. He was fading and fast. The silver bullet was a poison in his veins, a burning sickness that severed his connection to the primal healing of his wolf. He stumbled, his immense frame tilting dangerously. "Leave me," he gritted out, his voice slurred. I'll hold them off. You run." "Shut up," she snapped, the fear making her harsh. "You die, and I just committed treason for nothing. Keep moving." "Who are you?" he asked again, the question haunting him. "Nobody," she panted, shouldering more of his weight. "Nobody risks a silver bullet for a dead king." "I'm not dead yet," he muttered, a ghost of defiance in his tone. "Prove it," she challenged. They reached a steep incline, a sheer face of granite and ice hidden behind a thick curtain of frozen hemlock. Layla shoved the branches aside, her numb fingers breaking the icy coating. Behind it was not a cave, but a fissure, a deep, narrow crack in the bones of the mountain. "In," she ordered. Kalen didn't have the strength to argue. He half fell, half crawled into the darkness, collapsing against the cold stone wall with a groan that spoke of utter exhaustion. Layla scrambled in after him, then turned and carefully pulled the frozen branches back across the opening, weaving them into a ragged, natural curtain. Absolute blackness swallowed them. The only sound was Kalen's ragged, wet breathing, each inhale a struggle. The coppery scent of his blood filled the small space, mixed with the clean, cold smell of stone and the fading, bitter notes of wolfsbane. Layla fumbled in the pocket of her apron, her frozen fingers closing around a cheap plastic lighter. She flicked it. The small, wavering flame was a tiny sun in the void. It illuminated a nightmare. Kalen was pale, his skin taking on a worrying gray tinge. The wound on his shoulder wasn't just bleeding, it looked necrotic, the flesh around it black and weeping a dark, viscous fluid. The silver was spreading, killing him from the inside out. He opened his eyes. The brilliant gold was dimmed, clouded with pain, but the intelligence there was still sharp, still terrifying. "Celine," he whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a confession of a wound deeper than the bullet. Layla's heart twisted with a pity she didn't want to feel. She knelt beside him, the cold of the rocks seeping through her clothes. "She wasn't coming, Kalen. She sent them." He closed his eyes. A single tear escaped, cutting a track through the grime and blood on his face. It was a tear of rage, of grief, of a future obliterated. "Then let me die," he breathed. "The kingdom, it can have the carcass." "No," Layla said, her voice firm. She began unbuttoning his soaked, heavy coat, her movements clinical. "The king might be defeated, but the man has to live. Hold still. This will hurt." Pain was an old acquaintance to Kalen Dawn. But this was different. The silver was a spiritual violation, a theft of his very essence. The new pain of the knife blade, however, was a stark, clean anchor. Layla worked quickly, her stormy eyes narrowed in concentration. She wasn't a medic, but she knew wounds, knew how to dig for a trap's tooth, how to remove a splinter of cursed wood. This was no different, just larger and more important. Her hands, red and chapped from dishwater, were steady. She found the jagged, cursed piece of metal nestled against bone and pried it free with the tip of her knife. It clinked against the stone floor, a tiny, evil sound. "Got it," she murmured. She pulled a flask from her inner pocket, cheap, burning whiskey, the kind truckers bought. "This will sting," she warned, and poured it over the open wound. Kalen's whole body arched, a strangled groan ripped from his throat. His hands clenched into fists, but he didn't pull away. "Sorry," she said, not sounding sorry at all. She packed the wound with clean strips of cloth torn from the hem of her uniform. "Can't cauterize it. Smoke would give us away. This will have to do." She sat back, wiping her bloody hands on clean snow she scooped from the entrance. The poison is out. You'll heal slow, but you'll heal." Kaelin watched her through a haze of pain. She was shivering violently now, her thin uniform useless against the cave's deep chill. The fire in her lighter had died, leaving them in darkness again. "You're freezing," he rasped. "I'm fine." "Come here," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I'm burning up with fever. You're shaking apart. It's thermodynamics." A weak, almost laugh escaped her. "Thermodynamics? Just come here, Layla." She hesitated in the dark. Then, slowly, she scooted closer, her back against the stone wall beside him, not touching. "Closer," he murmured. "I don't bite. Not tonight." Swallowing her pride, she shifted until her side pressed against his, careful of his injured shoulder. The heat that radiated from him was immense, a furnace stoked by his body's desperate battle. It seeped into her frozen bones, a blissful, life-giving wave. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was their breathing slowly synchronizing. "Why?" he asked again, the word echoing in the dark. "You heard them talk. You knew the risk. Why not just hide?" Layla stared into the blackness. "Old man Harkness," she said quietly. "He runs the bait shop on the lake. Last winter his roof caved in from the snow. His granddaughter was inside. He couldn't afford the repairs, couldn't pay the pack taxes. A week later, a crew showed up, fixed the roof, rebuilt the room, no bill. The work order had a palace seal on it, but someone had scratched it out. That was a discretionary fund, anonymous. Waitresses hear everything, Your Majesty, she said, a faint wry tone in her voice. People think we're part of the furniture. They talk. They talk about the alpha who raises taxes on the ore mines, but quietly fixes roofs. I didn't know if you were a good king, but I knew you weren't only a monster. The silence this time was different. It was heavy with shared understanding, a thread of connection spun in the dark. She sold me, Kaelin said, the words final. My fated mate. Were you? Or did everyone just tell you you should be, that it was politically neat? Kaelin didn't answer immediately. He searched his memory, his feelings. The bond with Celine had always felt like a mild current, a sense of pleasant compatibility. He had never felt the earth-shattering pull, the terrifying electric stringency the old tales spoke of. He had felt duty, expectation, a smart alliance. He had never felt this strange, quiet recognition in the dark. This wolf inside him, buried under poison and pain, lifting its head at the scent of rain and ozone that clung to her. Who are you, really? He whispered, turning his head toward her in the darkness. You track like a hunter. You fight with a knife. You cover your scent like a ghost. I'm a rogue, she said, and he felt her stiffen. Is that a crime in your kingdom? Technically, he admitted, his voice low, unregistered wolves are considered a threat to the peace. Are you going to arrest me? There was a challenge there, a flash of the fierce spirit that had driven a knife into a man's leg for him. Kaelin let out a breath that was almost a laugh. I am currently bleeding in a cave, relying on a rogue to keep me alive. I think a pardon is in order. A quiet, almost soundless chuckle shook her shoulders. It was a lovely sound. Jareth Vance, Kaelin said suddenly. What? The man in the lead SUV. I saw the crest on the door panel before the lights went out. Jareth Vance, my head of security, my friend. The word tasted like ash. If Celine sold me out, she sold him to him. Layla nodded in the dark. I heard the name Vance whispered. He wants the throne. He wants the power, Kaelin corrected, a new cold edge entering his voice. Celine wants the crown, a perfect partnership. The bitterness was a living thing in the cave. They deserve each other. What will you do? Layla asked. Kaelin was silent for a long moment. He looked toward the hidden entrance, as if he could see through rock and snow to the kingdom that had betrayed him. The confusion and pain were burning away, forged in the fever of his blood into something new, something hard, something sharp. The man who had waited in the diner was gone. What was left in the dark was the core of the king. "I'm going to survive," he said, each word a vow carved in stone. "I'm going to heal, and then I'm going back." He turned his head, and even in the utter blackness, she felt the intensity of his gaze. "But I can't do it alone. I have no army, I have no guard. I have a waitress with a stolen knife." Layla didn't flinch. "You have the truth." "I need more than truth," Kalen whispered, his voice gravelly and close. He reached out, his hand finding hers in the darkness. His skin was scorching, his grip firm. The outside blizzard raged, hunting for them, but inside the stone womb of the mountain, the Alpha King, betrayed and broken, didn't feel like a ruler on a distant throne. For the first time, he felt like a man who had stumbled upon the one thing worth fighting for. "Sleep, Layla," he murmured, his voice dropping to a low protective rumble. "Dawn comes early." And as Kalen drifted into a fitful, fevered sleep, he didn't dream of crowns or betrayals. He dreamed of the scent of a coming storm and the steady, watchful presence of a pair of gray eyes in the dark. Dawn did not break over the mountains. It seeped into the sky, a slow stain of bruised violet and iron gray. The storm had exhausted itself, leaving behind a world buried under 3 feet of pristine, silent snow. The silence was absolute. It pressed against Layla's eardrums. Kalen woke to the smell of blood. Fresh blood, hot and metallic. It wasn't his own. That scent was old now, a dull copper note in the cold air. His eyes snapped open, his body tensing before his mind fully registered the cave around him. The movement was stiff, painful, but the blinding, feverish agony of the silver was gone. A deep, aching soreness had taken its place. He was healing. The wolf inside him, so silent and distant before, now paced just beneath his skin, alert and hungry. He turned his head toward the faint light at the cave entrance. Layla was there, crouched in the fissure's opening, a silhouette against the bright snow. She was skinning a snowshoe hare with efficient, ruthless motions, using the same boning knife from the night before. The morning light caught the blade, flashing red. She looked different in the dull daylight. She had shed the soaked diner apron. Over her thin uniform, she now wore an oversized, threadbare flannel shirt, likely from a hidden stash in her backpack. Her dark hair was tied back severely, revealing the sharp lines of her face. She worked with a focused grace of someone for whom this was not a skill, but a necessity. "You're awake," she said without looking up. Her voice was clear, stripped of the fear from the night. "Eat. We move in 10. She tossed something toward him. Kalen's hand shot out and caught it on reflex, a strip of raw, dark meat. His wolf surged forward with a desperate, primal hunger. Without a second thought, he ate it. The raw protein hit his system like a lightning bolt, a jolt of vital energy that sharpened his senses and steadied the lingering weakness in his limbs. It wasn't a king's meal. It was a survivor's fuel, and it was the most powerful thing he'd ever tasted. "You know how to hunt," Kalen observed, his voice still rough with sleep. He watched her clean the knife with handfuls of snow, her reddened hands moving with sure, practiced strokes. "I know how to not starve," she corrected, standing and brushing snow from her knees. "There's a difference. Hunting implies sport. This is just Tuesday for a rogue." Kalen pushed himself to his feet, testing his weight on his legs, rolling his injured shoulder. It pulled tight, a warning throb of pain, but the muscle held. The black, weeping wound had closed to an angry red pucker. "His healing is accelerating. By tonight, I'll be at 50%. "Good," Layla said, shouldering her battered canvas pack. She finally looked at him, her storm gray eyes assessing him like a piece of equipment. "Because 50% of an alpha is still better than 100% of anything else out here." They set out into the white void. The world was a blank page, and their footprints were the first marks upon it. The terrain was brutal, steep, icy ridges hidden under deceptively soft powder, granite teeth waiting to snag an ankle. Layla took the lead. Kalen, accustomed to walking at the head of any procession, found himself following, and he watched her. She didn't move like a soldier with measured, forceful strides. She moved like a shadow, like water finding its path. She flowed around obstacles, choosing lines of travel that seemed illogical, until she saw how they used the land's contours for cover and easier footing. She noticed everything: a subtle shift in the wind that meant a change in weather, a single snapped twig at knee height that spoke of a predator's passing, not a prey's. She read the silent forest like a book he'd never learned to open. By noonday, the weak sun was high, blinding as it reflected against the endless snow. They stopped by a frozen stream to drink, breaking the ice with rocks. The water was liquid ice, shocking their systems into greater alertness. "We need a plan," Kalen said, the words forming clouds in the air. He cupped more water to his mouth. "We're walking north, toward the border." "Toward the Craglands," Layla stated, wiping her mouth. Kalen frowned. The Craglands were a myth and a warning, a jagged, desolate spine of mountains riddled with abandoned mines and old wars, considered impassable and cursed. "The Craglands are a death sentence." "Exactly," she said, her gaze scanning the tree line constantly. She turned her sharp eyes back at him. "We're walking into my backyard." "Your backyard is a legendary graveyard." A faint, almost soundless smile touched her lips. "The Craglands are full of old mining tunnels, forgotten supply caches from the border wars, and signals." "Signals?" "Radio towers, old analog repeater stations before the satellite network." She adjusted her pack straps. "If you want to know what's happening in your kingdom without tripping every digital alarm, Jareth Vance has said, you need to shout on a frequency nobody uses anymore." Kalen stared at her, this woman who served pancakes and knew about dead zone radio traffic. "Why were you at the diner, Layla? With these skills, you could have had a place in any border patrol, a ranked position in a pack." She stiffened, her eyes fixed on the frozen water. "Packs have rules, Kalen. They have hierarchies. You kneel to the alpha. You bare your neck. You accept the place they give you, which for someone like me, no lineage, no pedigree, is at the very bottom, looking up." She finally met his gaze. "I don't kneel." "You saved a king," he pointed out softly. "I didn't save a king. I saved a man who was outnumbered and betrayed. I don't like bullies, whether they wear crowns or tactical gear." The words hit him with unexpected force. They stripped away his title and saw the core of the action. He felt seen, not as a symbol, but as a person. A strange, warm feeling, entirely separate from the cold, bloomed in his chest. "I am not a bully, Layla."
"You're an alpha," she said, as if that were the entire complicated answer. She turned away. "Come on, we're losing light and we need to reach the high ridge before dark to check for the tower." As she turned, Kalen caught a new scent on the crisp air. It was faint, buried under pine and snow, but unmistakable. The sharp, acrid tang of her fear. It spiked suddenly, a silent scream on the wind. "Wait," he growled, his voice low and urgent. He moved faster than thought, grabbing her arm and yanking her behind a massive snow-draped boulder. She stumbled against him, a question in her eyes. "Drone," he breathed, pointing a finger upward without exposing himself. High above, a black speck circled against the vast blue sky. It was silent, electric, a malevolent insect. It moved with a purposeful, searching pattern. "Jareth's tech," Kalen muttered, pressing closer to the stone. "They're grid-searching the forest. They know we didn't take the roads." Layla pressed her back against the cold rock, her shoulder tight against his chest. He could feel the rapid, frantic flutter of her heartbeat. "Can it see heat?" she whispered. "Yes. Thermal imaging." "Then we're two glowing candles in the snow." "Not if we mask it." Kalen's eyes darted to the frozen stream, then back to the drone as it banked, beginning a lower, slower sweep toward their position. "The water. It's near freezing. It will hide our thermal signatures." Layla looked from the drone to the stream, its black water flowing under a skin of ice. Her face paled. "You want us to get in that? Do you want to live?" The drone's hum became audible, a low, threatening buzz descending toward their sector of the forest. Layla didn't argue again. She slid down the bank and into the water. The gasps she let out was a strangled, pain-filled sound, instantly muffled as she submerged to her neck. Her face went deathly white. Kalen followed, the cold hitting him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. It was agony, a million needles stabbing into his flesh, seizing his muscles. "Under the bank," he commanded, through teeth that wanted to lock shut. They huddled under a shallow overhang of ice and root, submerged to their chins in the glacial flow. Kalen wrapped his arm around her, pulling her tight against him less for comfort and more to anchor her small, shuddering form against the gentle but relentless current. She was trembling violently, her entire body convulsing with the shock. The drone buzzed directly overhead. It stopped, hovering. They could see the dark lens of its camera swiveling, scanning the riverbed below. Kalen pushed his own metabolism, forcing his body to burn energy at a dangerous rate, generating heat. He became a furnace in the icy water, radiating what warmth he could into Layla's frozen body. He pressed his lips close to her ear, his voice the barest vibration. "Focus on me. Look at me. Just breathe." She turned her head, her lips a terrifying shade of blue, her eyes wide with a pain that went beyond the physical. She was looking into the face of death by cold, and it was in his arms. For a long, endless minute, there was no kingdom, no throne, no betrayal. There was only the icy water stealing their life, the drone hunting them from above, and the terrifying, fragile connection between them as they clung to survival and to each other. His wolf, stirred by her proximity and the primal danger, did not howl in rage this time. It pressed close to the surface, a warm, protective presence. A quiet, undeniable certainty settled in Kalen's soul. "Mine." The word was not a command. It was a recognition, as fundamental as his own heartbeat. After an eternity, the drone's buzz changed pitch. It lifted, banked, and moved away, continuing its methodical search pattern. "It's gone," Kalen rasped, his body now numb. "Out. Now." They hauled themselves out of the stream, movements clumsy and slow. The moment they left the water, the air attacked. Their soaked clothes froze instantly, becoming stiff, icy shrouds that crackled with every movement. "We have to move," Layla stammered, her voice slurred by her chattering teeth. Hypothermia was not a threat. Now it was a reality, closing its fist around them. "Shelter. Now." Kalen's alpha vision, sharper than any human's, scanned the ridgeline. "There," he pointed with a shaking hand. "A roofline, a cabin or a shack, a mile, maybe less." "Then we run," she said, the words a desperate puff of vapor. "We have to run." The run was a nightmare of stumbling, falling, and forcing frozen limbs to work. The cabin was a ruin, a forgotten ranger station with broken windows and a door hanging from one hinge, but it had a roof and walls. They burst inside, collapsing on the dusty wooden floor. "Fire," Kalen gasped, his hands useless, frozen claws. "Anything that burns." Layla, shaking so hard she could barely control her limbs, kicked apart a rotten wooden chair with a strength born of sheer desperation. She shoved the splinters into a rusted potbelly stove in the room's center. Kalen fumbled for his lighter. Click, click. Nothing. The flint was soaked. "No," he snarled, a spike of real panic piercing the cold. "Give it." Layla snatched it from him. She cupped the lighter in her hands, blowing on it, trying to warm the mechanism with the last of her body heat. She struck it. A spark, then a tiny, beautiful flame. She lit the dry moss and lichen she scraped from the cabin walls. The fire caught, hungry and bright. They stripped. There was no time for modesty, no room for embarrassment. Wet clothes were a death sentence. They peeled off the frozen layers, leaving them in a stiff pile by the door. Kalen stood in his boxers for the growing fire, his body a testament to a life of violence, a tapestry of old scars and the livid new wound. He was power, honed by survival. Layla turned away, wrapping herself in a moth-eaten, dusty blanket she found on a bare cot. She huddled close to the stove. "You're still shivering," Kalen said, his voice returning to its normal depth as the heat seeped into him. "I'm fine." He didn't ask. He walked over and sat behind her on the floor, pulling her back against his chest and wrapping the blanket around them both. "He's body heat," Kalen stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "It's medical necessity." She stiffened for a second, a lifetime of isolation and caution fighting against the simple, animal need for warmth. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from her very bones, she melted against him. The heat he radiated was profound, a solid wall of life pushing back the cold. They sat in silence, listening to the fire crackle and the wind moan outside. The world had narrowed to this single, warm point in a frozen universe. "Why, Celine?" Layla asked quietly, the question hanging in the smoky air. Kalen rested his chin lightly on top of her damp head. "The Gray Shore Pack controls the northern shipping lanes. My advisors, they said a union would secure the economy, secure my flank. They said affection could grow from duty." He was silent for a long moment. "They were wrong." "You were wrong," she corrected, softly but without malice. "You thought you could be the king they wanted, practical, unfeeling, a statue on a throne." "And what am I?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her back. She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "I saw you in the diner. You looked at that empty chair like it held your entire world. That's not a statue. That's a man who wanted to believe in something." He shifted, turning her slightly so he could see her profile in the firelight. "I was looking for a future where I wasn't alone." His hand came up, almost of its own volition, and cupped her cheek. His touch brushed away a smudge of soot. His touch was rough, but infinitely gentle. "I'm not alone now." The air between them grew still and charged. The ozone scent that was uniquely hers filled his senses, mingling with wood smoke. His wolf was awake now, attentive, its presence a warm pressure in his chest. Layla looked up at him, her stormy eyes reflecting the dancing flames. She saw the gold in his eyes glowing softly, not with alpha command, but with something far more dangerous and real. "Kalen," Layla breathed, a warning and a question. "I know," he whispered. He didn't move to kiss her. He didn't need to. The understanding that passed between them in that look was more intimate, more binding than any physical touch. It was a pact forged in ice and fire. It was the acknowledgement that their paths had irrevocably tangled. He was her king in exile, she was her guide in the wilderness, and they were both something else to each other, something they didn't have words for, but that hummed in the space between their hearts. "Get some sleep," he murmured, his arm tightening around her in a protective circle. And as they drifted into an exhausted sleep, wrapped together for survival, the first move in their silent war was already being plotted in the mind of the alpha who was no longer a ghost and the rogue who was no longer invisible. The climb to the repeater station was a brutal test of will against rock and gravity. Kalen's strength was returning, but the silver's poison had left a deep, echoing weakness in his marrow. Lila moved ahead of him, a sure-footed shadow against the granite, finding handholds he couldn't see, choosing paths that seemed to defy the mountain's logic. They reached the summit as the sun began to dip, casting long, cold shadows. The tower was a skeletal giant of rusted steel, groaning in the wind. The shack at its base looked ready to collapse, but a faint, steady green light glowed from within a cracked console. Lila didn't hesitate.
She pushed the creaking door open and went straight to the equipment, her fingers flying over dusty dials and switches with an intimacy that surprised him. She wasn't just familiar with radios, she understood them, knew their secrets. "Give me a frequency," she said, her voice all business. "Anything secure they'd use for official broadcasts." Kalen gave her the codes that were supposed to be known only to him and his inner council, codes Jareth Vance would now control. The static hissed and popped, a sound like frying ice. Then a voice, polished and somber, cut through the noise. It was the kingdom's chief broadcaster. "A day of profound mourning. The body of our beloved Alpha King, Kalen Dawn, has been recovered from the wreckage. His vehicle was ambushed by a rogue wolf faction in a cowardly act of terrorism. The state funeral will be held at dawn in the Crystal Courtyard." Kalen's hand clenched into a fist on the rusty console. To hear his own death announced was a surreal, hollow blow. The broadcaster continued. "In this time of crisis, the Royal Council has unanimously appointed General Jareth Vance as Regent Protector to guide the kingdom and root out the threat that took our king. His first act is one of necessary strength, the purge of the unregistered. Effective immediately, all shifters not sworn to a recognized CAC are to present themselves for registration and assessment. Those who resist will be considered enemies of the state." The words hung in the cold, metallic air of the shack. Lila had gone perfectly still. Her color drained from her face, leaving her looking carved from marble. This wasn't just about a throne. Jareth was using Kalen's murder to legitimize a genocide. He was signing death warrants for every rogue, every lone wolf, every outcast like her. He was hunting her people. The broadcast droned on, but Lila's hands were already moving again, her jaw set. She tuned to another frequency, this one tighter, more encrypted. It took her longer, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then a different voice, smug, familiar. Jareth. "The ceremony is set tonight. The Grey Shore girl is compliant. The brother is secure. Once the vows are said, the last legitimate claim to the Dawn bloodline is mine by marriage. The purge will cleanse the land of resistance before it can form." A softer, strained female voice answered, "Celine, you promised you would release him after the wedding. And I will, as long as you continue to be the perfect, grieving queen who found solace in her brave protector. One tear out of place, my dear, and the boy joins the king in the afterlife." The transmission cut. The silence in the shack was heavier than the mountain around them. Celine was not a traitor. She was a prisoner, a pawn with a knife at her brother's throat. The betrayal somehow felt deeper, more profane. It wasn't ambition, it was desecration. Kalen looked at Lila. Her stormy eyes were burning with a cold fire he had never seen. It wasn't just fear for herself, it was fury for every person Jareth had just sentenced. Without a word, Kalen reached past her and took the microphone from the hook. He didn't switch to Jareth's encrypted channel. He turned a massive, ancient dial to the very end of the spectrum, to a frequency used decades ago by trappers and outposts, a band of static and ghosts. He keyed the mic. The act felt more significant than any royal decree he'd ever issued. "This is Kalen Dawn." His voice was not the polished tone of the throne room. It was rough, scarred by cold and pain, alive with a barely contained rage. He glanced at Lila, who was watching him, her expression unreadable. He spoke to her as much as to the unseen listeners in the dark. "If you are tired of kneeling, if you are tired of being hunted for the crime of wanting to breathe free air, meet me at the Iron Gate in the Old City, not at dawn, at midnight. Come if you believe a pack is built by loyalty, not by blood." He released the button. The static rushed back in, a vast, empty sound. He had just shouted his location to his enemies. He had thrown a lit match into a dry forest. For the full minute, nothing. Then the speaker crackled. A voice, old and cracked as autumn leaves, yet sharp as a flint edge, broke through the noise. "The Iron Gate," the voice said, slowly, each word weighed and measured, "has been sealed for 50 winters.
They welded the locks. They poured concrete. A pause that stretched Kalen's nerves tight. Then the voice returned, grim and final. But we never lost the key. The transmission ended. Lila let out a slow breath, her eyes meeting Kalen's. The plan was insane, a direct assault with an army of ghosts against a fortified city, but the alternative was to let Jareth's purge paint the snow red. Kalen set the microphone down. We move, now. As they turned to leave the shack, a new sound whispered from the speaker, not a voice, but the faint digital beep of a signal being traced. They had been on the air just a few seconds too long. Jareth's hunters now had a direction. Midnight in the Iron District was a time of deep, restless shadows. The skeletal remains of factories stood like tombstones against a sky stained orange by the distant city lights. The air smelled of rust, damp concrete, and a profound, echoing silence. The Iron Gate itself was a monument to forgotten strength. 30 feet of riveted, blackened steel, once the main entrance to the city's industrial heart, now fused shut by decades of decay and deliberate sealing. It stood at the end of a canyon of derelict buildings, a dead end. Kalen and Layla crouched on the roof of a gutted textile mill, looking down at the empty expanse of cracked pavement before the gate. The cold ate through their stolen jackets, taken from the unconscious guards at the radio tower. The only sound was the mournful whistle of wind through broken windows. "He's not coming," Kalen murmured, his breath a cloud in the gloom. The old voice on the radio had been a spark of hope, but this silence felt like truth. Who would answer the call of a dead king? "Give it time," Layla whispered back, but her eyes, endlessly scanning the darkness, betrayed her own doubt. Rogues don't keep palace hours. The ancient clock tower on the mill struck 12. The brassy, broken notes shivered through the district, a funeral toll for a foolish dream. Kalen closed his eyes. He had led them into a trap, a wide open space, perfect for an ambush. He was about to tell Layla they had to leave when she stiffened, her hands clamping on his arm. "Listen." At first, it was just a shifting in the silence, like the settling of a great beast. Then, a scrape of boot on gravel. A soft cough, muffled, not from one direction, but from all around them. They weren't alone in the square. They never had been. From the mouth of a sewer main, a figure emerged, an old woman wrapped in layers of ragged wool, leaning on a gnarled hawthorn cane. Her face was a map of wrinkles, but her eyes caught the faint light and reflected it back, a sharp, lupine glint. From a collapsed fire escape, a young man dropped soundlessly to the ground. He held a long pipe wrench like a warrior's hammer, his mechanic's coverall stained with oil. From doorways, from windows, from the very shadows themselves, they came. Dozens, then hundreds. They carried hunting rifles, pry bars, kitchen knives lashed to poles. They wore the uniforms of their invisibility, janitorial smocks, delivery driver jackets, patched winter coats. Their faces were grim, gaunt, resolute. They filled the square, a sea of silent, watching eyes, all fixed on the roof where Kalen stood. The old woman, Rhea, stepped forward, her cane tapping on the concrete. The crowd parted for her as if for royalty. "We heard the radio," she called up easily, her voice carrying in the stillness. It was the voice from the static. "We heard the king was dead." Kalen stood. He didn't descend with regal grace. He jumped down from the low roof, landing with a heavy thud that echoed. Layla followed, landing lightly beside him. He walked to the center of the square, the crowd a living wall around him. "The king is dead," Kalen announced, his voice rolling over the gathered rogues. "The man who sat on the throne, who trusted the wrong people, who let a viper into his house, that man died in the snow, betrayed by his own." He turned in a slow circle, making eye contact with as many as he could. He saw fear, yes, but underneath it, he saw a hunger for something more than scraps. I am what's left, he said, his voice dropping, becoming more personal, more dangerous. I am the one they tried to murder. I am the one who now hunt, and I'm the one who is going to tear the throat out of the usurper who wants to paint this city with your blood. He reached out and took Layla's hand, pulling her forward to stand at his side. A ripple went through the crowd. She is Layla. She has no pack name. She saved my life when my own fated mate sold it. She fights not for a crown, but because she hates bullies. He looked back at the sea of faces. I cannot promise you safety. I cannot promise you an easy life. I can only promise you a fight. And I promise you this. If we win tonight, the walls come down. No more gray zone. No more unregistered. One territory. One pack. Your pack. For a heartbeat, there was only the wind. Then a low sound began. It started at the back, a rumble deep in 100 chests. It wasn't a cheer, it was a growl, a collective, vibrating agreement that shook the very pavement. Rhea nodded, a slow, definitive dip of her chin. She reached into the folds of her coat and pulled out an object, not a key, but a massive, rusted iron lever, like a railroad switch. She walked to the side of the monumental gate, to a mechanism hidden under grime and ivy. Stand ready, she said, not raising her voice. The crowd understood. She heaved the lever. For a moment, nothing. Then, with a shriek of metal on metal that had not moved in half a century, a hidden counterweight dropped. Chains as thick as a man's thigh rattled through pulleys. The sound was deafening, a giant waking from stone sleep. And slowly, impossibly, the great iron gate began to swing inward. The path to the city, to the palace glowing on the hill, was open. But as the gate groaned to a halt, a teenager, breathless and bleeding from a cut on his forehead, pushed through the crowd. Rhea, they're early. Purge squads, 3 of them. They're sweeping the Warrens. They're heading straight for the old brewery. The Warrens, the labyrinthine basement where the most vulnerable rogues, the children, the sick, the elderly, were hidden. The triumphant moment shattered. The army of ghosts had been found before it could even march. Layla's head snapped toward Kaelin, her strategic mind clicking into gear. They'll bottle us in the district if we charge the palace. They'll slaughter the Warrens as a warning. Kaelin's mind raced. Divide, distract, protect. The tactics of a battlefield, not a throne room. Rhea, he commanded, take half. Anyone who knows the Warrens like their own skin. Get there, get them out. Lead the purge squads on a chase through the Undercity. Be ghosts, be nightmares. He turned to the rest, his voice rising to a battlefield pitch. The rest of you, you make noise, you break things, light fires in the warehouses to the south, far from the Warrens, make them think the king's army is 100 strong and everywhere at once. He looked at Layla. And us? Layla met his gaze, the storm in her eyes calm and deadly. We do what they'll never expect. We don't go through the streets. She pointed a finger not at the palace gates, but upward toward its glittering glass-peeped spires. We go over them. I know a way. The roar of the diversion ignited behind them as Kaelin and Lila slipped into the silent throat of the city. Their path was not one of streets, but of forgotten arteries, storm drains that tasted of rust, maintenance tunnels humming with distant power, and finally, the sheer, dizzying climb up the service lattices on the city's inner wall. The Palace of Dawnhaven was not just a building, it was a mountain of carved white stone and crystal, glowing against the night like a captured star. Its beauty was a lie. It was a gilded cage and a tomb in the making. Lila led him to a point where the outer wall met the sheer cliff of the palace's foundation. There, hidden behind a cascade of brittle ivy, was an opening, a narrow, arched channel of age-blackened glass and lead, barely wider than his shoulders. The Glassmaster's tunnels, Lila whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space.
for repairing the crystal ceilings and windows from the inside, abandoned when they switched to synthetic panels a generation ago. "How do you know this?" Kaylin asked, the question he'd held back finally escaping as they crawled into the glittering, claustrophobic passage. The world outside became a distorted mosaic of light and shadow through thick greenish glass. For a long moment, he heard only her breathing and the scuff of their clothes on the gritty lead lining. "My mother," she said finally, the words tight. "She was a seamstress for the palace. She pointed them out to me once from the gardens, told me they were a secret world, a way to see without being seen." She didn't elaborate, and Kaylin didn't press. The pain in her voice was a fresh, private wound. The tunnel ascended, a dizzying, fragile climb through the palace's superstructure. They passed over vast, empty ballrooms, dim libraries, and opulent, silent corridors. The world of the palace was laid out beneath them, like a doll's house, beautiful and dead. Then they crawled over a smaller, more intimate chamber, a sitting room all pale silk and silver, and there, seated rigidly on a divan, was Celine. She was a portrait of gilded despair. Her famous ash-blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, her gown a spill of icy blue satin, but her hands were clenched in her lap, knuckles white. Her face, turned toward a fire that did not warm her, was utterly vacant, save for the track of a single, silent tear cutting through the perfect makeup. Kaylin stopped, his breath catching. This was not the face of a triumphant traitor. This was the face of a soul in chains. The last of his rage toward her curdled into a sour, helpless pity. He had lost his throne. She was losing her mind. Lila's hand touched his ankle, a silent signal to move. He tore his eyes away, the image of Celine's despair burning into him. They were nearing the central spire, where the royal apartments in the chapel were, when Lila froze. She held up a fist. In the dead silence of the tunnel, Kaylin heard it too, a faint, rhythmic scraping ahead. Not rats, boots on lead. Someone was in the tunnels. They had seconds. The tunnel had no side branches. Lila frantically pointed to a section where the glass was thicker, murkier, creating a deeper pocket of shadow. They pressed themselves into it, melting into the gloom, holding their breath. Two figures in black tactical gear, not palace guard uniforms, moved past their hiding spot. They moved with confident precision, checking junctions, communicating with hand signals. They were sweeping the tunnels. Jareth knew. He knew about this route. The ambush at the radio tower hadn't just given them a direction, it had confirmed a suspicion. Lila's secret wasn't a secret anymore. As the second guard passed, his shoulder brushed against the glass, inches from Kaylin's face. Kaylin didn't move, didn't blink. The man paused, his head turning slightly. He peered into the shadow. Lila's hand found Kaylin's in the dark. Her fingers were ice cold. This was it. The fight would happen here, in this crystal coffin, and the noise would bring the entire palace on them. Then, a crackle from the guard's earpiece. A voice, tinny and urgent. "All units, converge on the South Warrens. Significant rogue activity confirmed. The king's ghost is leading a riot there." The guard in front of them snorted. "Ghosts in the trash heap? Let them play. This sweep is a waste of time." He turned and moved on, following his partner. They waited until the sound of scraping boots faded completely. Lila let out a shuddering breath. The diversion was working. It was drawing Jareth's forces away, but it had also exposed their own plan. "We have to move faster," Kaylin murmured. "He'll realize the attack in the Warrens is a feint." They crawled onward, the way now clear, but tainted with the knowledge of their vulnerability. The tunnel ended at a latched lead panel. Lila carefully unclasped it, peering through into a dark, dusty space, a narrow gallery high in the wall of the palace's utility shaft, a canyon of piping and echoing emptiness. "This is it," Lila whispered.
From here, we can drop into the servants' passages that lead to the chapel annex. As Kalen moved to climb out, his foot dislodged a small, loose piece of lead lining. It clattered down the inner wall of the shaft, bouncing off pipes with a series of sharp, ringing pings that echoed like gunshots in the vast space. From far below, a shout went up. A beam of light lanced upward, sweeping the walls. They were compromised. "Go, now!" Kalen hissed. They swung out from the tunnel and onto a narrow maintenance ledge. The drop was 50 feet to a hard concrete floor. The only way was across a series of pipe junctions and electrical conduits, a treacherous tightrope walk in the dark. They moved, balanced, jumped. Kalen's greater strength was a liability here, his weight threatening to pull brackets from the wall. Lila was a phantom, light and sure-footed. The lights below multiplied, shouts echoed, coordinates being called out. A shot was rang out, ricocheting off a pipe with a deafening shriek. Lila reached the far side, a platform with a service ladder. As Kalen leapt the last gap, a bullet grazed his calf. He hissed in pain, his grip on the wet pipe slipping. Lila's hand shot out, grabbing his wrists with a strength that belied her size. For a terrifying second, he dangled, his weight almost pulling her over. She braced, teeth gritted, and hauled him onto the platform. They didn't pause. They scrambled down the ladder as the platform above was lit up by flashlight beams. They hit the bottom running, bursting through a door into a warm, silent hallway, smelling of starch and soap. The servants' quarters. But the door opposite them flew open. A palace guard, his uniform undone, stared at them in shock. Before he could shout, Kalen was on him, a clean, silencing strike. He caught the man as he fell, dragging him into a linen closet. They stood in the dark, panting, listening to the shouts and commotion echoing down the utility shaft they'd just escaped. They were inside the palace, but the palace was now awake and hunting them. And somewhere above, in a chapel of glass and lies, a wedding was beginning. The servants' passages were a silent, panicked maze. Lila navigated by instinct and hazy childhood memory, leading them upward toward the sacred heart of the palace. The distant, solemn chords of the wedding processional began to filter through the stones, a grotesque soundtrack to their flight. They emerged in a shadowy alcove overlooking the chapel of Dawn's promise. It was a breathtaking cage of crystal and moonlight. Below, the elite of the kingdom were gathered, a sea of jewels and anxious faces. At the altar, under a massive, faceted skylight, stood Jareth Vance. He wore the regent's gold sash over a uniform of immaculate black. He looked every inch the savior king, his expression one of grave responsibility. Beside him, Celine was a statue of frozen sorrow. Her hand rested on Jareth's arm, but it lay there like a dead thing. The high priest's voice boomed, echoing in the crystal chamber. "To unite the grieving kingdom, to provide strength in this hour of darkness." Kalen's blood burned. This was his funeral pyre, and they were dancing on it. "We need to get down there," he growled, scanning for a route. A direct charge was suicide. Lila wasn't looking at the chapel. Her head was tilted, her eyes distant. "Do you hear that?" Kalen listened. Underneath the priest's drone, underneath the muffled sobs of a few in the crowd, was another sound, a deep, rhythmic, mechanical thrum. It was vibration more than noise, coming up through the very floor. "Foundations," Lila whispered, her face pale. "He said the foundations were rigged. It's not a metaphor. It's not just the palace walls." She pressed her hand flat against the stone of the alcove. "It's the ground. He's built something underneath us, something big." The realization was an ice water bath. Jareth's final play wasn't just to claim the crown. It was to hold the entire city, the entire kingdom hostage from beneath its feet. If he couldn't have it, no one could. "The detonator will be with him," Kalen said, his eyes locking onto Jareth. "At the altar, a dead man's switch, or timed to the ceremony. Or both,"
Lila said, her mind racing. "We can't just take him out. If he falls, if his heart stops, it might trigger the blast." The priest's words rose to a crescendo. "Do you, Selene of Greyshore, pledge your life and loyalty to Jareth Vance, your regent and protector, to bind your fate to his for the salvation of the kingdom?" A terrible silence held the chapel. Celine's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Her eyes were wide with terror, scanning the crowd, not for rescue, but for someone she couldn't see. Her brother. Jared's smile was gentle, public, but his fingers dug into her arm, a private, vicious command. Kaelin made a decision. He wasn't just saving a throne, he was saving a city of innocents sleeping in their beds, unaware the ground beneath them was a bomb. He turned from the chapel view. "We find the source, we disconnect it." "The plans, the original structural plans," Lila said, urgency making her voice sharp. "They'd be in the royal architect's vault, in the old foundations." It was a desperate gamble, to go down, away from the crown, when every instinct screamed to seize it. But Kaelin nodded. He was done playing Jareth's game on Jareth's board. They retreated back into the stone bowels of the palace, now descending, following the growing thrum of hidden machinery into the ancient, unmortared bedrock upon which Dawnhaven was built. The air grew cold and damp. The finery of the upper palace gave way to rough-hewn stone tunnels, lit by bare, flickering bulbs. They were in the kingdom's skeleton. They found the vault, a heavy iron door standing ajar. Inside, chaos. Blueprints and schematics were strewn everywhere. And in the center of the room, standing over a table, was an old man Kaelin recognized with a shock. Silas, the retired royal architect, his father's most trusted builder. Silas looked up, his face not surprised, but etched with the profound, weary grief. "Kaelin," he said, his voice raspy, "I prayed you were alive." "Silas, what is this?" Kaelin demanded, gesturing to the chaos. "It's my sin," the old man said, crumpling a blueprint in his gnarled hand. "My greatest work perverted. Jareth, he came to me years ago with his father's old designs, brilliant, unstable things, geothermal taps, structural stress dispersal chambers. He said he wanted to fortify the palace, make it a true fortress for his king. I believed him." He spread a massive, yellowed schematic on the table. It wasn't a blueprint for a building, it was a diagram for a machine, a network of chambers drilled into the bedrock, filled with canisters labeled with symbols for flammable gas and unstable mineral compounds. Lines connected them to the palace's main support columns. "He called it the king's last argument," Silas whispered. "If the palace is ever taken, the supports vaporize, the mountain of stone comes down, and the shockwave, it would trigger the fault line. The whole valley would crumble." Lila traced a line on the schematic to a central control room. "Here, the master trigger. Is it only from the altar?" Silas shook his head despairingly. "The altar is a wireless trigger, a timer linked to the ceremony's completion. But the primary manual control, it's in the control room itself. He would want to see it, to hold the power in his hands." The thrum was a physical pulse now. Somewhere close, the machine was alive. "Where?" Kaelin asked. Silas pointed a trembling finger to a dark archway at the back of the vault. "Through there, the entrance to the subcrypts. But Kaelin, he's down there. He wouldn't leave this to underlings, not tonight." Kaelin and Lila shared a look. This was the end of the maze, not a chapel of glass, but a tomb of stone. As they moved toward the archway, Silas called out, his voice breaking. "The secondary charge!" He was paranoid. If the main control is tampered with incorrectly, a smaller localized charge will detonate in the chamber itself, a final spite. Kaelin didn't look back. He stepped into the darkness, Lila a silent shadow at his side, descending into the belly of the bomb. The subcrypt was not a room, it was a cavern. The ceiling was the raw bedrock of the mountain, dripping with mineral-heavy water. The walls were lined with racks of canisters, humming with contained violence. In the center stood a monolithic console of brass and obsidian, covered in switches, dials, and a single large lever encased in glass. A countdown timer glowed with a soft green light. And standing before it, his back to them, was Jareth Vance. He didn't turn. "I wondered if you'd take the bait," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "The chapel was too obvious, too theatrical. But this," he gestured around the cavern, "this is real power, the power to unmake. My father understood that." Kaelin stepped forward, his movements careful. Lila fanned up to the side, her eyes scanning the console, the racks, looking for the secondary charge Silas had mentioned. "Your father was a brilliant madman. You are his perfect son. You built a tomb and called it a throne." Jareth finally turned. In the gloom, his face was all sharp angles and cold fury. The public mask was gone. "My father saw the weakness. He saw that a king who cannot destroy his kingdom utterly will always be at the mercy of those who can. He offered your father the ultimate deterrent, and he was executed for his vision." Spittle flew from his lips. "I have perfected it. Now the king is the deterrent." "Where is Celine's brother?" Lila asked, her voice cutting through Jareth's fervor. Jareth's eyes flicked to her with disdain. "Safe, as long as she plays her part upstairs. When the timer reaches 0 and we are pronounced bound, the wireless signal will disarm the citywide charges. Only the chapel charge will remain. A tragic accident for a grieving, unstable queen who couldn't bear her loss. Poetic, don't you think?" He was insane. Not with rage, but with a cold, logical insanity that saw murder and genocide as elegant solutions. "You don't have to do this, Jareth," Kaelin said, taking another step, trying to draw his focus. "Your grievance is with me, with my father, not with the city, not with every shifter without a pedigree." "My grievance," Jareth hissed, "is with a world that values blood over brilliance. After tonight, they will value only survival, and I will be the one who decides who survives." Lila had edged close to the console. Her eyes were fixed on a seemingly innocuous pipe junction beneath it, where the wiring converged. A small brick-shaped package was wired in line with the main feed, the secondary charge. Jareth saw her gaze. A cruel smile touched his lips. "Ah, Silas told you about my little insurance policy. Go ahead, try to disable the main charge. The feedback will trigger it. This chamber will become our shared sarcophagus." A standoff. They couldn't touch the console. They couldn't kill Jareth without potentially triggering the dead man's switch, and the clock was ticking down to a wedding that would seal the city's fate. Kaelin's mind raced. There had to be a flaw, not in the machine, but in the man. "You're right, Jareth," Kaelin said, changing his tone. He sounded defeated. He let his shoulders slump. "You've won. You've thought of everything. My father was a fool. I was a fool." Jareth's eyes narrowed, suspicious. "The crown," Kaelin continued, his voice thick. "It's yours. I won't fight you. Just call off the purge. Let the rogues go. Spare the city. You'll have your kingdom, a clean one." For a second, avarice and triumph flickered in Jareth's eyes. This was what he wanted, not just the power, but the acknowledgement of his superiority from the very bloodline that had spurned him. It was the opening Lila needed. While Jareth was captivated by Kaelin's feigned surrender, she didn't go for the main console or the secondary charge. She moved to the wall of canisters. Following the schematic in her mind, she found the main feeder line, a thick armored hose snaking from the racks to the console. It carried the volatile mixture to the dispersal units. She didn't have a tool. She had her hands. She gripped the hose where it connected to a canister, her muscles straining. With a final desperate heave, she twisted the heavy coupling. A hiss of escaping gas filled the cavern, a sharp chemical stench. Jareth's head snapped toward her. "No!" The system wasn't disabled, but it was breached. The pressure would drop, the dispersal might fail. The machine was wounded. Enraged, Jareth lunged not for Lila, but for the glass case protecting the master lever. He would trigger it all manually now, in his fury. Kalen moved. He met Jareth's charge in the center of the cavern. This was not a fight for a crown. It was a brutal, desperate brawl in the dark. No finesse, no honor, just fists, teeth, and the will to live. Lila, ignoring the fight, dropped to her knees at the console. The secondary charge was still live, but the main system was bleeding out. The timer read 00117. She had to disarm the wireless receiver, isolate the chapel charge. Her fingers flew over the wiring, tracing paths. She found the receiver module. With a snap, she ripped it free from its housing. Above, in the chapel, the wireless signal would fail. The citywide charges should now be inert, but the chapel charge. A roar of pain echoed. Kalen had Jareth in a crushing hold, but Jareth had a knife, silver-edged, buried in Kalen's side. They were both bleeding, weakening. Lila looked at the secondary charge, then at the main lever. Jareth's hand was inches from the broken glass case. If he reached it, he could still slam the lever, sending a manual signal through the wounded but possibly still functional system. There was no choice. She reached for the secondary charge, not to disarm it, but to contain it. She wrapped her hands around the brick of explosives, her body shielding the console. She yanked it free from the wiring in one brutal motion. A shrill alarm screamed in the cavern. Red lights strobed. Jareth, with a final guttural scream of triumph, broke free from Kalen's grip and smashed his fist through the glass, seizing the master lever. Lila turned, clutching the live charge to her chest, and threw herself directly at Jareth. He saw her coming, his eyes widening in confusion a split second before she collided with him. The impact drove them both backward, away from the console, toward the cavern wall. Kalen, bleeding profusely, roared her name. Jareth's hand still on the lever was wrenched downward as he fell. Nothing happened. The system was too damaged. The lever clicked uselessly. But the secondary charge in Lila's arms, its trigger mechanism now fully armed from being ripped out, began a high-pitched final whine. Lila met Kalen's eyes across the cavern. Her expression was calm, resolved. Then she rolled, taking Jareth with her, into the dark mouth of a side tunnel, just as the world dissolved into a deafening, concussive boom. The cavern shook, stone dust rained down, a section of the tunnel entrance collapsed in a roar of shattered rock, and Lila was gone. The silence after the blast was more terrible than the noise. It was a ringing, absolute void, filled only with the trickle of dislodged stone and Kalen's own ragged, sobbing breaths. "Layla!" He scrambled over the fallen rubble, his injured side screaming in protest, his hands tearing at sharp rocks until they were bloody. The tunnel was completely sealed, a wall of broken granite. He clawed at it, a raw, animal sound tearing from his throat. He was a king of nothing. He had saved a city of ghosts and lost the only real thing he had ever held. The console behind him flickered, the timer dead at 000000. The chapel charge, isolated, had not detonated. The city was safe. He had won. He had lost everything. A faint sound behind him made him turn, his heart a hammer of futile hope. He wasn't Layla. It was Silas, the old architect, standing in the vault's entrance, his face ashen. "Kalen, the palace, it's in chaos. The wedding?" Kalen didn't care. The world above could burn. Then a scrape, a tiny shifting sound from the other side of the rubble pile. Not from the sealed tunnel, from a narrow ventilation shaft in the cavern wall, high up. Grit and pebbles pattered down. A small, gray, dust-covered paw emerged from the shaft, followed by a muzzle, then the entire, bedraggled form of a wolf. She was small, lean, one ear torn and coated in white stone dust. She dropped to the floor, shifted in a ripple of painful-looking motion, and became Layla. She was alive, bruised, bleeding from a dozen new cuts, her clothes torn, but alive. She coughed, spitting out dust. Kalen was across the cavern in 3 strides, catching her as her legs buckled. He held her, his arms trembling, unable to speak, just pressing his forehead to her hair, breathing in the scent of rain and ozone and stone dust. "The secondary tunnel collapsed behind us," she gasped against his shoulder. Jareth, he was closer to the blast. He didn't get up. There was no triumph in her voice, only a hollow exhaustion. She had lured him into the tunnel, using her own body as bait, knowing its structure might channel the blast away from the main cavern and the console. A suicidal gamble that had paid off. "You," Kaylin's voice broke, "you were supposed to be my guide, not my sacrifice." "You are the king," she whispered, her strength fading. "The city needed its king. I was just a waitress who knew the back way out." He held her tighter. "No, you are my equal. You are the heart of this kingdom I didn't know was missing." The sound of booted feet, cautious and many, echoed from the vault entrance. Rhea stepped aside as figures filled the doorway. Rhea, her cane gone, holding a rifle, and behind her a dozen ragged, fierce-eyed rogues. They had fought their way from the Warrens, through the panicked palace guards. Rhea took in the scene, the destroyed console, the sealed tunnel, the king holding the bleeding rogue. Her old eyes softened for a fraction of a second before turning hard again. The palace guard is leaderless, confused. The nobles are hiding in the chapel, terrified. The regent is gone. Her gaze settled on Kaylin. "What is your command, King Dawn?" Kaylin looked down at Layla in his arms, then at the faces of the people who had answered the call of a ghost. They weren't his subjects. They were his pack, his first true pack. "Secure the chapel," he said, his voice gaining strength, the alpha tone returning, but different now, tempered. "No one is to be harmed. Bring Celine Greyshore to the throne room, find her brother, and send for the palace physician." He lifted Layla into his arms, ignoring the flare of pain in his side. "The throne room, Silas, now." He carried her out of the tomb of stone, away from the machinery of death, and up toward the gilded cage that was now his to break open. Chapter 10. The Howling Kingdom. The throne room of Dawnhaven was a place of cold majesty, all white marble and towering banners depicting the Dawn Wolf. It was built for intimidation, for the silent weight of history. Tonight, it was filled with a very different kind of power. Kaylin did not sit on the obsidian throne. He stood before it, Layla beside him, her wounds cleaned and bandaged, standing on her own strength, though she leaned slightly on his arm. They were both still in torn, blood-stained clothes, a stark contrast to the room's splendor. Before them stood the kingdom. To one side, the nobles and high-pack alphas, their finery rumpled, their faces pale with fear and confusion. To the other, Rhea and her rogues, a wall of grim, defiant survival. In the center, alone, stood Celine, still in her wedding gown, her brother, a boy of about 12, clutching her hand, both of them trembling. The room was silent, waiting for the axe to fall. Kaylin spoke, and his voice filled the space without need for shouting. "Jareth Vance is dead. His plot to destroy this city is ended." A murmur rippled through the nobles. "He betrayed his king, tortured an innocent woman, and declared war on his own people for the crime of being free. His reign lasted minutes. Let his memory be ash." He turned his golden gaze at the nobles. "Many of you supported him, out of fear, out of ambition, out of blindness. Your judgment will come, but not from me. It will come from the packs you lead when they learn how close you led them to annihilation." Then he turned to the rogues. "You answered the call of a ghost. You fought not for gold or land, but for the right to exist. You have bled for this kingdom today more than many in this room have in their entire lifetimes." Finally, he looked at Celine. Her eyes were huge, fixed on him, waiting for condemnation. "Lady Celine Greyshore, you were used as a weapon against me and against yourself. No blame rests on you.
You and your brother are under the protection of the crown. Your pack's standing is intact. You are free." Celine's knees gave way. She didn't collapse, but sank into a deep, trembling curtsy, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Thank you, Your Majesty." Kaelin stepped away from Layla, moving to stand directly between the two halves of his shattered kingdom. "The peerage is hereby abolished. The laws of lineage and registration are void." A shocked gasp came from the noble side. "From this moment, there are no rogues in the northern territories. There are only wolves of the north." He pointed to Rhea. "The Craglands and the Grey Zone are hereby recognized as sovereign territory of the Free Pack, with Alpha Rhea Mistwell as its rightful ruler, with a seat on this council." Then he turned back to the throne, but not to sit. He reached out a hand to Layla. She took it, and he drew her forward to stand beside him in the center of the dais. "This is Layla. She has no ancestral name. She was a waitress in a diner you would never visit. She saved my life when my world was darkness. She saved your city when you were all blind. She has more courage, more loyalty, and more true strength than any fated bond or bloodline could ever provide." He faced the entire room, his grip on Layla's hand tight. "I stand with her, not as a king with his queen, but as a partner, as a founder of what comes next." He raised their joined hands. "We will build a new way, a pack founded on loyalty earned, not blood decreed, on strength of character, not strength of claw. If you will follow us into that dawn, then stay. If you cling to the old night, then leave this territory by sunrise." For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. The old world and the new hung in the balance. Then Rhea took a step forward, then another. She walked across the no-man's land of marble and knelt on one knee, not in subjugation, but in respect. Her rogues followed, a wave of knelt figures. One by one, then in groups, the nobles and alphas began to kneel. Some were reluctant, faces stiff with pride. Others seemed relieved, as if a great heavy yoke had been lifted. Celine was the first of them to kneel, pulling her brother down with her, her head bowed not in fear, but in gratitude. The throne room was silent, but it was a full silence, a united silence. Kaelin looked at Layla. Her storm-gray eyes were bright, not with tears, but with a fierce, dawning hope. She squeezed his hand. The howl started low, from Rhea's chest, a single resonant note. It was picked up by her pack, then by others. It built, not a savage cry of conquest, but a deep, rolling, affirming song of unity, a song for a pack finally made whole. It shook the crystal chandeliers. It shook the very foundations of Dawnhaven. But this time, the foundations held. The first light of true dawn was not gentle. It was a blade of clean, white gold light that cut through the stained glass windows of the throne room, illuminating the dust still hanging in the air from the night's chaos. It found Kaelin and Layla, still standing hand in hand on the dais, their people rising before them. The howl subsided into a murmur, then a waiting quiet. The ceremony was over. The work was just beginning. Kaelin did not give orders from the throne. He stepped down among them, Layla at his side. He went first to Rhea, helping the old woman to her feet. "The Warrens," he said, "your people first. Medical aid, food, warm clothes from the palace stores. Take what you need." Rhea's sharp eyes assessed him, then gave a slow, approving nod. "A good first order, founder." The word hung in the air. Founder, not Your Majesty. It spread through the crowd in a whisper. Founder Dawn. He moved to Celine, who was being examined by a physician. "A suite of rooms is yours for as long as you wish," he told her. "You are a guest of honor, not a prisoner. When you are ready, we will discuss the future of the Greyshore lands, on your terms." Celine could only nod, fresh tears of a different kind, tears of healing welling in her eyes. For hours, he and Layla moved through the palace, not as conquerors taking inventory, but as stewards assessing damage. They spoke to guards, to servants, to the frightened cooks hiding in the kitchens. The message was the same. The war is over. Your place here is secure. The new kingdom needs your hands. It was in the kitchens that Layla finally stopped, staring at the vast, humming industrial dishwashers. A young scullery maid, no older than 15, peeked out from behind a pantry door, her eyes wide. Layla walked over, crouching down so she was at the girl's level. "What's your name?" "Alara, milady," the girl whispered. "Alara, do you know how to make the cinnamon rolls? The ones they served in the East Wing solarium on rest days?" Alara blinked, surprised. "Yes, milady. My mom taught me. She was the head baker before—" She trailed off, afraid. "Before Jareth replaced her with someone from a proper pack," Layla finished softly. Alara nodded. "Well, Alara," Layla said, standing, "as of today, you are the head baker. I want those cinnamon rolls for everyone in this palace by midday. Can you do that?" The girl's face transformed, fear replaced by stunned, glowing pride. "Yes, milady." As they walked away, Kaelin smiled, a real, unburdened smile. "Head baker? A kingdom runs on its stomach, and good cinnamon rolls mend more fences than royal decrees." By afternoon, a semblance of order had emerged from the chaos. The wounded were cared for, the frightened were calmed. In the council chamber, now cleared of Jareth's maps of purge sectors, Kaelin and Layla sat with Rhea and a few of the steadier noble alphas. The first law of the new council was drafted and signed not with a royal seal, but with the fingerprints of all present, the Founding Accord. It guaranteed territory and voice to the Free Pack. It abolished the bloodline requirement for council seats. It established a new rule. Leadership could be challenged not by combat to the death, but by a trial of worth, of character, strategy, and service to the whole pack. It was messy. It was argumentative. A few alphas stormed out, refusing to sign. They were allowed to leave in peace, their lands forfeit to the crown, but their lives spared. As the dissidents left, Rhea watched them go, then turned to Kaelin. "You let wolves with teeth at your throat walk free. That is either great wisdom or great foolishness." "Time will tell," Kaelin said, "but a pack ruled by fear is just a slower kind of bomb. I will not build another one." Later, alone in a quiet solar overlooking the healing city, Kaelin finally turned to Layla. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind the deep ache of their wounds and the profound weight of what they had done. "Your mother, the seamstress, she worked here," he said gently. Layla gazed out the window, her arms wrapped around her. "She did. She was the best. She made your father's coronation cloak." She took a shaky breath. She loved the beauty of this place, but she saw the rut underneath, the way people like her were looked down upon. "She took me and left when I was young. She died in the gray zone, sick from the damp, because the palace healers wouldn't treat a service wolf." The last piece of her puzzle clicked into place for Kaelin. Her knowledge, her deep, intimate hatred of the hierarchy, her desperate need for a world where a person's worth wasn't sewn on their collar. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate. "She would have liked you," Layla said softly, finally looking at him. "The you that you are now, not the king on the posters, the man in the cave." Kaelin reached for her, not to pull her close, but to take her hand, linking their fingers. "The man in the cave would have died without you. The king on the poster would have become a monster. You didn't just save me, Layla. You remade me." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture of pure, exhausted trust. "We remade each other." Outside, the city buzzed with uncertain life. The first of Rhea's people were moving through the gates, not as invaders, but as new citizens. The flags of the Free Pack, a simple gray wolf on a field of white, now flew beside the Dawn Wolf banner. The kingdom was not fixed. It was a broken bone, just set. It would need time and care to heal strong. but for the first time in 100 years, it had a chance. 6 months later, the snow had retreated to a dusty lace on the highest peaks. The first stubborn wildflowers pushed through the thawing earth of the craglands, and in the city, the scars of the coup were being slowly woven over with new growth. The midnight griddle was packed. The neon sign buzzed its familiar, irritating anthem, casting its pink glow on a clientele that would have been unthinkable a year before. At the counter, a high-pack alpha in tailored leathers argued good-naturedly with a grizzled rogue trapper about the best bait for ice fishing. In a corner booth, Celine Grayshore, dressed in simple, sturdy clothes, was teaching her brother how to play chess, a small, genuine smile on her face. Behind the counter, Lila wiped the formica with a clean rag. She wore a silk blouse the color of storm clouds, a gift from Celine, but over it was her old, familiar apron. It was her uniform of office. The kitchen door swung open with a bang. Kalen emerged, holding a plate aloft. He wore jeans and a simple black t-shirt dusted with a spectacular spray of flour. A smudge of something dark and unidentifiable was on his cheek. He placed the plate in front of Rhea, who held court at her usual end of the counter. "Caramelized apple pancakes," he announced with pride. "A founder's special." Rhea poked the suspiciously blackened edges with her fork. "It's burnt, boy." "It is caramelized," Kalen insisted, crossing his arms. "A complex Maillard reaction." "It's burnt," Rhea said again, but she was already cutting into them, a grudging twinkle in her eye. "But I suppose even founders must start somewhere." Lila leaned against the back counter, watching him. The weight of the crown had changed him, but not in the way she feared. It had settled on him, not as a burden, but as a responsibility he shared. The cold, distant king was gone. In his place was a man who laughed more easily, who listened more intently, and who was, by all accounts, a spectacularly terrible short-order cook. He caught her looking and winked. He walked over, sliding an arm around her waist, ignoring the good-natured whistles from a table of off-duty city guards. "You smell like syrup," he murmured into her hair. "You smell like scorched batter and poor life choices," she retorted, leaning into him. "I am a founder. I can decree that this is the official scent of progress." "You can try," she laughed, the sound still surprising her with its lightness. He turned her to face him, his golden eyes warm in the diner's light. The shadows of betrayal and winter were gone, replaced by a contented, steady strength. "Happy?" he asked, the question simple and profound. Lila looked around, at the mingled scents and sounds of a pack that was no longer a dream, but a messy, loud, breathing reality. At the window, where the new monument in the square, the melted-down iron gate recast as a statue of a wolf and a woman standing back to back, caught the afternoon sun. "We have work to do," she said, because it was true. The council was a constant debate. Old prejudices died hard. There were still border skirmishes, still shortages, still 1,000 problems to solve. "We have a lifetime." His voice was a soft promise against the diner's cheerful din. He didn't kiss her. Their bond, their partnership, needed no public display. It was in the way they stood together, in the trust that passed between their linked hands, in the shared weight of the future they were building. One pancake, one law, one healed rift at a time. Outside, the sun dipped toward the mountains, painting the sky in colors of fire and hope. The long, bitter winter was truly over. The pack was whole, not because of a faded bond or an ancient bloodline, but because of a choice made in the dark and a note passed on a receipt. The Alpha King and the Waitress were no more. In their place stood the founders, and their story, the story of the North, was just beginning.